there's a real difference between loving what you do and getting a job, you know. And I think the danger is if you get this balance wrong, is you focus too much time on how can I get the role. You know, people often say, what do I have to do for you to feel I can get this role? And I'm like, that's not my job. Our job as headhunters in this space is for you to be somebody who could be considered for a shortlist. Once you get on a shortlist, you then have to, of 4 to 6 people who will be interviewed, you then have to interview well. And so I think you don't want to overthink this. You want to love what you do first. And then there are different skills for getting on a long list. So how do you get considered? Then to getting on a short list, to then getting hired. So there are different things, but I think don't overthink it as well. Just love what you do. And if you're good at what you do, you'll develop a good reputation. And that is how people hire on the whole.
Well, welcome to the podcast, Dave. How are you?
Yeah, great, thank you. Really good. I'm good form. It's actually Friday. What's the date? It's the 23rd of June. There's no one in our office today. Some people are at Glastonbury. So it's actually quite a nice, we're based in Bath, so we're not that far away from it. So it's probably a more relaxed day than normal in many ways, which is kind of nice. I'm the one stuck here still, but there's something about Glastonbury at this time of the year, which, longest day just gone. So yeah, I could probably a bit more relaxed than normal, maybe.
Amazing. Sounds great. Well, look, I'm really interested to get your expertise about the blend of people in teams and how you might bring new people in. But before we get into that, could you just give me a little bit of a background to you? Because I think you've got a really interesting and quite unique background that perfectly positions you to do what you do. So could you just give us a background to start off with?
Sure, yeah. So I guess my background, well, it's funny actually, I've started in some circles explaining it slightly different. And I heard Damien Hughes speak. We were doing some work with the FA, and he was on before us. And the way he described himself is he said, I'm a coach's son. And that's what I am. And I'd never explained it that way, but it's quite a good way of explaining my upbringing. My dad played rugby, coached rugby. So I came through, and he was a PE teacher. So grew up in and around teams, dressing rooms, basically his childcare was looking after me. Or not looking after me at all, me just happening to be at the place where he was doing the coaching. And that's kind of my upbringing. And then I got into playing rugby myself, played professionally for a number of years. And then as I came out of it, as players transition, as any athlete transitions out of whatever sport they do, professional or not, it's like, well, what do I do next? And there's probably a whole story there, but I managed to ended up going into recruitment, decided that was something that is a people business, and develop relationships. I didn't, you don't have to gain further qualifications to work in that industry, but if you get your head down and work hard, you can, do well. You become advisors of the business that you work with and the people that you meet. So that was the industry that I went into. And Gemma, who one of my wife's best friends, ran her own hedge fund headhunting firm, so financial services, and she was the one who kind of guided me a little bit. Well, I probably ever thanked her publicly, so there you go, Gemma. And
go Gemma.
Yeah, and I wanted to get out of sport for a while. I was really keen. Right. I had, sports science physiology degree, grown up in sport, and then obviously played for a long time. So I was a bit like, I want to do something. I want to understand business. So she was like, what else are you interested in? I was like, I don't know. And I was reading a lot about climate change and sustainability. So found a business that was in that area called Miramar, Andy and Ross, great guys, and worked there for 3.5, 4 years, and set this business up effectively 10 years ago off the back of a realization that I saw the process of rigor and professionalism of how people were recruited in industry in the corporate world, and chemical and energy sector was specifically what Miramar were working in at the time, or what I was working in. And I was just in Germany in an airport and doing 3 different searches, but the same process. And I was like, why doesn't sport do that? And I was specifically, and I didn't know, but I was specifically thinking about the impact of people on my career. And I was thinking of the S&C coach who genuinely made me believe that I was physically had the potential to play professionally. I was thinking, if that person wasn't there then, where would I be now? So I'm thinking of coaches, and that's where it came from. I guess my own experience as an athlete, and I spoke to a few people and quickly realised there was a gap. There definitely was not. It was still very much kind of jobs for the boys. It was who you knew, and trust is a vital element in sport more than any other industry that I've worked in. And that's fine. We maybe talk about it in a minute, but that's how the business started. So it started as a performance recruitment specialist in sport. And I guess I had, to your point, I had something unique, shouldn't be unique, and it's not 100% unique now, somebody who'd been on the sports side as an athlete and then also had recruitment experience. And so combine those two things of understanding the context and the environment of what people were going into. We've changed a lot since then, but that's where it started, and that's my background.
Yeah, okay. You mentioned a couple of things there, which I might come back to, just about that trust and that recognition of the value add that people can bring. But before I get into that, maybe just tell me a little bit about Elite Performance Partners. I mean, without it specifically being all about your business, but
Yeah,
I'm sure you'll want to describe it. But for people who don't know about that additional support that employers can access to find people to get support, what is it you do?
Yeah, cool. So I guess where sometimes, we are very much kind of like client facing. We work with the organizations in sport, predominantly in sport. We do an odd bit outside, but it's nearly all sport. So sporting organizations. So we work on the client side as opposed to the candidate. So we're not in the business of finding people jobs. We're kind of in the business of helping teams or helping our clients create high performing teams or get closer to achieving what they want, which sounds a bit cheesy, but effectively how our business has grown to include an advisory piece, because what happened was we were known for recruiting high performing experts, whether that's performance directors of football, rugby, cricket, heads of strength and conditioning, that space, physios, doctors, the world very well.
Yeah.
And we were realizing often that the people hiring them were not performance experts. In fact, sometimes they weren't performance people at all, as in they hadn't worked on high performing perhaps, but not in that world. And we were often going into search processes for hiring a person when they needed to start 4 or 5 steps before about what success looked like or what the organization looked like. So no hire is ever in isolation. So we realized there's a much bigger piece. We actually totally talked ourselves out of business for the first year or two because it was kind of like, you don't need to hire somebody, you need to reorganize and reposition. And so I think we didn't have the language to articulate that at the start, but we now have effectively 3 parts of our business, which enables really individuals and organizations reach their potential. Is kind of, if you had to put it into a sentence of where it's at. So an advisory bit of working with the leaders, both executive and performance, to unpick what it is that they're trying to get to and how they get there. So very simply, if you look at your world of where are we now, where do we want to get to, and how do we get there, it's kind of, if you had to really simplify, and sometimes it is about giving the executive leaders the language to articulate what it is they're looking for. On the performance side, we do work with some really senior, the better performance people, and where they see the value is the fact that we're in the market, we get a helicopter view of different sports, whereas the very best performance leaders just don't have that luxury. They're working in one organization focused on their team and their individuals. Yes, strategically perhaps, yes, maybe looking out in terms of the vision of where they're getting to, but they're not in 10 or 12 or 15 teams. So what we can often bring is either letting people know that don't worry, you're doing fine. You're having the same problems
the
that
grass isn't
everybody
greener.
else has.
It's actually you're ahead of the game.
Yeah,
Right.
and as soon as you give the leaders that if you give them a bit more confidence, they relax and everyone else notices, and therefore you then get better. And when you look at particularly coaches, it can be very isolating for head coaches in football especially, but most sports. If you can make them feel like they're doing okay, then that's enough. So I guess we've got advisory, we've got lead search and selection, which is recruitment. Search would be headhunting specific roles against the criteria. Selection is our kind of head coach piece, because often there's a list. So we would have recruited coaches where 80 coaches are sent by 80 head coaches or managers sent by agents, and it's not a search process. You've got a list. How do you select the best 5 and the best 1 against the criteria? So that's the little bit. And then we've developed a leadership development part of our business, because we're often off the back of placing people in roles, sometimes brilliant people, where you've done a global search for them and then they get left to, I used to say rot or stagnate, but that's just not right. It's left to deliver. They don't have the time or space to develop themselves. So we've done some work in that space. It's kind of one-to-one, one-to-few, one-to-many. So like executive coaching in our business, leadership forums of peer-to-peer across sport learning. So we've won from football, cricket, rugby, tennis, rowing, so they can just learn from each other's mistakes and create a community where they feel supported, because actually it's pretty lonely at the top. And then the one-to-many is the work that we do around. So we're FIFA technical experts, which I love. That's just a pretty and then so we will do some work with them. We tutor on the FA technical directors course, which has just finished, some brilliant people on that. And we work with an organisation called Focus, which is kind of democratizing education, so it's cheaper for people who really want to learn, and that's really good fun. So I guess when we say, we think leadership could be better in sport, well, great, but why don't we do something about it? So that is hopefully our way of educating or shaping a bit of what we see and how it can maybe get better.
Okay, wow. So several different perspectives. It's not that that traditional sense of recruitment, just that. I suppose my metaphor I'm constructing on the fly is if you're a casting agent might find the right people, but rather than just letting them go and act, you're actually giving them some support and some coaching along the way, and trying to diversify some of the acting talent for those films in the future.
But actually, just to add to that metaphor, you're right. It is if you look at a cast, you get actors, don't you, who play off each other really well. So kind of jumping on that casting metaphor, I think it's a really good one. I'm annoyed I haven't thought about it myself before, actually. So
there's your gift for today.
Thank you. Although it's very clear now that I didn't think of it myself. If you think of, as you place an actor in a role, what you're thinking about is how do they connect with the other people on screen? What's the chemistry like? Who works well with other people? So, what I immediately thought of, if you're hiring The Rock, you're hiring Kevin Hart, how many films are they in together? Because they obviously have a brilliant connection. And connection's such a big part of what successful teams do well. And I think where we've definitely moved away from is thinking about transactionally roles as individuals. And every time you hire a person into a team or into an organization, you have an opportunity at that point to re-look at your team and to re-look at your organization. It's a much bigger opportunity than just one hire. And that's where we've kind of moved to. We've moved away from kind of like placing people into singular roles, although of course we do that and we love placing good people into good roles, but we've moved into the business of helping kind of those teams that we work with to kind of create high performing teams and improve. So it's just, there's loads of science around kind of how teams perform well and what it is about them that they do. And I think 70%, as work from my MBA, 70% of teams, their success is built on how they start. So how the team is set up is a really important, 70% of success is based on that. What's really cool about that, though, is that you can reset teams all the time. It doesn't mean that once it's set, you're done. You can constantly, and I guess the best leaders are the ones that we think that do that really well, is recognizing when it's best to carry on, or recognizing when it's just a slight shift, or recognizing when actually there's quite a significant shift that we need to make.
So whether it's picking up on The Rock and Kevin Hart kind of analogy, but as much as anything, what I'm curious to hear a little bit about is the concept, certainly in pro team sports, I think, where you have individuals move and squads go with them, backroom staff, for example, that you have sort of a complementary, I know them, I trust them aspect. What is it you're looking for? What are the dynamics that you're looking to try and respect? Because I think sometimes it's easy. Okay, we know each other, we trust each other, we've got each other's backs. There's a history of working together. Or are you looking for a combination that's got a bit more of a crackle to it, a little bit more spark, where actually we're not looking to recruit somebody that's just going to slot in and it's all going to be comfortable. We're going to look to bring somebody in that's going to shake things up, or
Yeah.
give it some sort of dynamism. What are the dynamics that you're sort of really looking for when you're working with a client?
Yeah, it's a really well put point. I think what we really enjoy doing is figuring out where the tensions are in any kind of brief. So if you're bringing somebody in, and so let's say it's a head coach, what are the tensions? So there's a real balance of pragmatism and idealism. Is that, and I think you've got to recognize that they're the ones in the arena, that they're the ones who are going to get sacked after 14 months, statistically, if you're in the Premier League. Might be less, but that's what it was a while ago. And so you've got to respect that. I think when people who make these hiring decisions, and they're like, well, they want to bring four of their mates with them. Of course they do, because that to them, if they're the people getting judged on the results, absolutely judged, then of course they're going to want to surround themselves with the people that they trust and feel like they're going to help control that situation. That's normal, that's human nature. So it's definitely getting the balance of the extreme of somebody bringing all the backroom staff, sometimes from a different country, and they might not even speak the language, which is, does happen. And then them getting fired, and then obviously being in a whole other set. So I think you do want to have some level of control from the club, because they are hiring that person. But how do you give that person, that group, the best chance of being successful? So there is a balance. We would tend to say a rule of thumb was, of course you can bring an assistant, because often the head coaches won't be doing, some of them are very hands-on, but some of them are less hands-on. Let's take a step back, and somebody else would be a better technical coach. You'd be developing individual development plans. You might have a couple of assistants who, and the point isn't about specifics. It's about how that organization or how those people work. And if they articulate it well as to why they might bring other people in, then you're probably more likely to let them bring them in. But when somebody goes, I bring all my assistants, why? Doesn't matter why. That's just what I do. You might not be as kind of keen to hire those people. So I think there's a real balance. And I think at the start of recognizing, okay, what does success look like? What is negotiable? What isn't? If you get that stuff right at the start, it gives you a much better chance of being successful. So, and that's the key, by the way, is we kind of look at, if you look at head coach, there's 4 stages to a process. There's deciding who makes the decision. So who's involved? And the reason you do that bit first is often owners might get involved at the end, which is totally cool. But if you don't know, or you don't articulate it at the start, suddenly they might come in and go, and it might throw the whole thing off. Second bit is, what's the core criteria? So deciding actually what's important. Third part is running the recruitment process. Fourth part is kind of setting that person up. So KPIs, how are you going to measure this person's success outside of results? They're the 4 fairly basic pieces. What we tend to see is people jump in at the end of the third. And what happens in sport, especially coaching, but which doesn't happen in any other industry that I've seen, is that people come with a list of names. So they might actually say, we're hiring a head coach. These 5 people are great. Okay, let's go back a bit. Or we've had agents who'll go, I've heard there's a role coming up. I have got 3 perfect candidates for you. Okay, well, there's a few issues here. 1, there's no such thing as a perfect candidate. 2, we haven't written the brief yet. We haven't decided what the core criteria are. So how could you know whether somebody's the right fit or not? And thirdly, how could all 3 be the perfect candidate? Because surely they're different people. So it's kind of like, it's just pulling it back to really give you more confidence that when you make a decision, and you know, you can never be certain because you don't know what's going to happen. It's sport. If you look at football, I just keep that as an example. It's a low-scoring sport, so luck does play a part.
Yeah.
So I think it's just factoring in those things. Got away from what the question was now, but that's kind of
No, that's
how we
great.
look at it.
That really is fascinating. And how many elements there are up for grabs when you're working with a client, when you're working with a company?
Mm.
If it's about maybe setting the criteria, are those the opportunities for you to say, or potentially in the background think, there's a few blind spots here. You're looking for this, this, and this. Have you thought also about this, this, and this? How much is up for grabs, and that you're co-creating the process with the company?
Yeah, good question. It is, I guess, a co-creation, but it's also often just giving people a language, an explicit language that they implicitly already know. So they know what good looks like. They've seen it, they've felt it. It's trying to. We work with a data analytics group, 21st group, who are brilliant around kind of more objective measures of performance. So it might be playing style, it might be performance. Do they make the teams better? It might be youth minutes. It might. There's a bunch of things that you can do there, and that stuff we really idealistically thought we're going to just change the world here. We're going to help people. We're going to inform so much decisions. We're going to change how people think, and we fundamentally haven't, because people who've been in the game for a very long time, they know what they know, and that domain expertise is really rich. What we have helped do, because you've got a framework of what you're looking at, is helped people understand the decisions that they've already made and give a bit more of a language to it. And you've been able to maybe just ask the question, well, we said at the start that this is what was important, and this person who's maybe longer towards the bottom of the list, you're holding them to account for the decisions that they've made at the start. And you've got to really respect that if a chairman, owner, or however might be, their head is on the block. So when they hire the experienced coach, it's because they're partly concerned, arguably, of how that's going to be perceived. Yeah. So if you're helping them realize that you're making a really rigorous decision based on the criteria that you gave, then they're more likely to do it through a process if it's been set up. So one of the kind of the big bugbears of mine is when people say, well, do you know what, let's just see if it's a good decision in a year or two. And I was like, that's not how decisions work. You can't, that's hindsight, and it doesn't, journalists can do that and look really wise in the event of things that have happened. But on today, is this the decision? Are we making the best decision with the information that we have? Are we comfortable that we've done everything we can to mitigate any risk, or to be as confident as we can be? That's the question. But that's just, it's appalling leadership if people come in with that. Or it's like you're basically washing your hands of whatever happens, and if it goes well, you take credit, and if it goes badly, you'll blame other people. So it's just I'm
just second guessing here. Is that when somebody is just looking for a name to keep the wolves from the door?
Sometimes I think you do get situations where a lot of people are involved, and if people aren't used to running a process like that, it's totally understandable that they go, well, let's see how we go. It's kind of, it's not criticism really. You understand why people say it. In answer to your question at the start about the co-creation piece, about how we do that, what we really do is we've got to be humble. We're not in the organization, we're just helping them. So what we tend to do is, if on a briefing call for a role, we tend to say, a lot of job descriptions, they have on average 25 to 30 things on them, whether that's responsibilities, criteria needed, those sorts of things. And that's a lot. If you look at them, it's very rare that everybody would be really good at all of those things. But more importantly, you can't assess people in an interview process or a traditional recruitment against that many. So what we try and do is get down what are the 5 or 6 things that are really important for this role now. And what we'll do is we'll let people, whoever we're speaking with, the client, they'll talk to us. So just download on us what you think, where's it's come from. And sometimes people can genuinely just talk for an hour. Sometimes they might need a bit of guiding, but you get to the point where, okay, right, and from that conversation, we pull out, we've done it a lot now. So you can already see, communication is really important here. You've really got to have a really good influencing relationship with certain people. Or they're a little bit, their strategy isn't great, so they recognise they need that. So you can pull out things, and then we play back what we think the 5 or 6 criteria are, and on the whole, we're not far off. But occasionally, really interestingly, somebody might go, "Oh no, did I say that? We heard that. Oh, I didn't mean it to be that strong." Okay, so it's kind of it's a co-creation in that sense, but it's our way of putting a bit more colour and context around a specific role, because it will be around the organisation as well.
Okay, and that's heartening to hear that is a rich process, rather than here was the last job description, here's the last set of criteria, just copy and paste. And where's the sort of tendency that you're sensing from most of the people that come to you? Is it around a technical skill set? Is it around a behavioural leadership skill, or is it a cultural fit, or a bit of a blend of all of those?
It is. So I think if you look at the work that we would do, it would tend to be more senior. So it would tend to be kind of leadership and management roles. And so it is often unpicking. It's not too difficult. Well, I'd argue it. The human side is still as important for practitioners. But when you are nearer the start of your career than the end, you tend to need to get to earn your stripes. You need to be on the ground. If you're a physio S&C coach, you need to be on the ground doing that work for a little bit of time. So you have to do that. But once you get to a certain point, those things, the technical experience is a hygiene factor, as in you need to have it on your CV or in your experience, but it's not the thing that's going to get you the role. And so often the work is, what are the human skills? People call them softer skills. They're comfortably the hardest things to get, so we just don't call them that.
I call them core skills.
Yeah, cool. Exactly. So it's like, and what are the things here that really matter? And it might be the type of person. So cultural fit is the only thing that we insist is on every brief. So it's kind of like, what is the environment that you create here? What sort of person thrives? And you can think of different organizations who would be different. And it's what we find is that sometimes it's quite hard for people to articulate that, but it's very easy for them to articulate where they don't thrive. So that's kind of, there's definitely a technical piece. Do they need some technical expertise? Then there's a piece around the human skills, and then there's a culture piece. We actually, during lockdown, we developed a model. So we suddenly went from having 14 searches to 0 in a week, March 2020. And we had some time to go, well, should we stop and just look at the work that we've done over the past 10, 20 years? If you look at the experience in the company, and we had a criteria approach always of 5 or 6 things. Can we look across sport, corporate, senior, junior? Are there a distinct number of kind of criteria buckets that we can look at and put all of these, over 1,000 criteria, there's over 200 searches, and we boiled it down to 9. There's only 9 buckets of things or criteria that you could put in. So technical skill would be on one side, cultural fit would be on the other. You've got the leadership skills, you've got the human skills, you've got the technical piece, and there's only 9. So I guess for us, sometimes we might even show people that. We tend not to actually in a brief, but help people articulate what's important, because people often, if you get to coaching again, of anything, it doesn't have to be a specific technical sporting coach, and they talk about the best coaches they've ever had, and you ask them what it was about them. It's occasionally it's technically, but it tends not to be.
Yeah.
So it's pulling out what those things are. And then the second piece is that, do you need to have done that somewhere before? Or do you have the ability to see the potential in people and train it? That's the other really interesting piece, because or if we talk about unlocking potential, how do you cater for that? And there's a big thing around the diversity. If you only value or overvalue experience, you're not going to have a diverse workforce, because there's many different groups being given the opportunities that others have.
Right.
So
Okay.
there's
So
that to factor in as well.
not just saying you've done something similar before, therefore that promotes your candidacy, but
Yeah.
but seeing that you've got the potential to grow into a role, that you've got some track record of adaptability and growth.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And are you
Yeah.
seeing differences in, I suppose, what I'd call, I guess, modern, progressive, forward-thinking organisations, and how I'll politely put it, more traditional organisations, ones that perhaps don't really want change, don't really want to be breaking the mold. They don't want to be perhaps as innovative. Are you seeing
Yeah.
big differences between the two?
Well, I guess we don't work with the traditional ones.
Okay.
because actually, our biggest competitor isn't the other companies who do similar things. It's apathy. it's that. So I guess you would
Oh,
have
okay. So they wouldn't even
in
come
any
to
environment.
you. They don't
Well,
want
they
they
wouldn't
don't
even
want the
think
process.
about. So we've got an office in Melbourne, in Australia. We've got some guys over there working for us, and we went over there at the start of the year, and actually really progressive country in terms of performance services, in terms of how their coach development, in terms of like some really outstanding stuff, in terms of how they recruit. It's quite a bit behind here, the UK, because the, well, their language, that it's quite an insular country because it's so far away from everywhere. So they learn from each other. We worked with a couple of, like a rugby league team and an Aussie rules team, and they were actually a couple of people were in the meeting from the other team because they collaborate so well. And yet we ran a workshop for 150 people across all different teams, and somebody actually put their hand up and said, why would we use a recruitment firm when we could just hire one of our mates? That was a direct quote, and we were like, well, maybe. So I guess that's kind of where it still is. The Jobs for the Boys approach that we identified here 10 years. And by the way, there are some great companies and organisations there, clearly, but there's still that. We can try and change that, but there are some people who get it who we work with. So we've worked with 60, 70 clubs and organisations over the time. We're working with 10 or 12 right now. So those ones, great. We're doing great work with them. There's then a group in the middle, and I enjoy trying to kind of challenge the status quo a bit and trying to help when you can see that there is some work that could help.
Yeah.
But there are some that are not there yet, and that's fine. That's fine.
And in terms of your support for the industry, you're clearly trying to make a difference in terms of making recruitment more open and, as we say, sort of forward thinking and diverse. If you were to sort of stretch your thinking to those people that are kind of trying to get into high performance, what are the sort of top tips that you've got for them who are trying to kind of break through, get in, get the trust of those people you might be appointing the people that are recruiting them? What are your thoughts there?
So do you mean people more kind of earlier in the process, just trying to get into sport?
Yeah.
I think there's just a really attentional balance between kind of like pushing and being respectful too. So kind of recognizing people's time, being respectful, but also if you do it in a friendly way, if you're polite, you can ask for people's help. You can do it in a way. So just curiosity is the key in this space. It's like, ask good questions, do your preparation, look at it as a job if you want to get into somewhere. And I mean, the blunt thing is, if you want to work in an industry, work for free. That is actually the easiest way. It's not palatable sometimes, and it seems a bit like, well, you can't say that, but that's how internships worked, and that's how when you're young you get a chance. That's when people go on trial for no money if they're applying. It's kind of, if you want to show genuine commitment, do that. Now you might not be able to do that financially. You kind of, frankly, you have to be quite privileged to be able to do that. And I think now you can't do internships for nothing. So, but I think just showing curiosity, being open, being present when you're doing it, that's the way to do it. And I think, and just being persistent and consistent about how you go about it, because it's hard and loads of people want to do it, and you've got to really want it actually. But if you're kind of just a good person around it and you ask good questions, that's the easiest way. I'm not thinking about a specific area. I'm just thinking about how you get into it, and then there's a balance between relationships and performance. I think and you've got to develop relationships, but you've also got to think about how you perform yourself. Yes, networks are important, but don't only focus on that. Do your work too.
Yeah, okay, but that's the implicit aspects of it, is that you've got to get in, you've got to knock on a few doors, you've got to contact
Yeah.
people. That jobs for the boys is probably a fairly derogatory term, for ultimately you're known. You have some reputation and a track record that somebody knows about. And so what you're hinting to there is you've got to showcase that. You've got to put yourself in front of other people in order to open the doors so that you can show what you can do.
And you do have to do some work on that, to think about, why would somebody take me on? And I think, we do some kind of coaching, mentoring stuff with coaches, and it's quite hard sometimes to articulate what it is about you that, why would somebody hire you, or why would somebody give you an opportunity? So what is that narrative? How do you talk about yourself? It's like almost an elevator pitch, isn't it? You've only got 30 seconds. Yeah. And how do you explain? So when somebody, meets you and they come away and goes, "Oh, I met this guy Steve today. He was great actually." "All right, why?" And you go, "Well, because of X, Y, and Z." What are the 3 things that you want people to remember? Because people don't remember much more than that. So how do you do that for them? And it's just do that work, have a think about it. And there is part of that is, and one of them might be just because they're so keen and enthusiastic. That's okay if that's one, but there probably needs to be a bit more than that.
Yeah, I remember coming out of the Beijing Olympics and getting loads of feedback from performance directors about staff, leaders, coaches, and support staff. And so, what is it you're looking for? And the overwhelming phrase that kept coming out was, "They just get it. They just get it." And it was that sort of intangible aspect of it, which we then had to say, what do you mean by "they just get it"? So we could be a little bit more specific about the sorts of things that we're looking to develop or coach or potentially hold people to a sort of performance management. And what about in terms of leadership recruitment? Is there any trends specifically about the things that increasingly people are looking for from their leaders?
Yeah, I think similar to what was said around that kind of the model and the 9 book, the things that people is being able to help articulate what is really important. So leadership is the thing that comes up all the time, of course, especially if you're in a leadership role, but being able to unpick what's really important, because leadership as a word or as a concept is broad. There's so much written about it. But what does leading in this organization look like now? How do you want this person to, I guess you could break it into a few different areas, but if you look at kind of what type of leader do you want the person to be? So what type of person do you want them to be? And therefore, maybe what style do you want them to do? How do you want them to work with their team? How do you want them to work organizationally across the whole thing? What impact do you want them to have on individuals? So there's so many, really trying to break it down as to how you want that person to work, recognizing the role the environment plays, because people will often go to bigger teams to get leaders, maybe who've been a bit lower down, when we use the example of, if you're looking for an academy manager, you might want to go somebody who's in League 2, who has to be extremely resourceful. Arguably, the more resource you get, the less resourceful you need to be. So having somebody who's had to do more than one thing and had an interesting career journey is often a way to do it. But for us, the leadership recruitment is just unpicking exactly what they mean. And I mean, leadership is the key to successful organizations. Like, unquestionably, it doesn't matter the plan that you have or the culture that you have, because those things vary. The only thing that we've seen that all the best organizations have is good leaders, and they're all different, but it's the only constant we've seen. I can't think of one right now of an organization doing well that hasn't been led well.
I mean, that's fascinating, and I totally agree. In that leadership behaviors, leadership skills is probably one of the quickest ways to get underperformance if it's just not right. What I can imagine that you would, if you're talking to potential candidates, I'd imagine that you'd be constructing a flow of questions to get to know the person, or explore different competencies and abilities. Have you got like a go-to that's always on there, a question that just unlocks insight into a particular candidate that you would typically ask for those senior leaders?
No, the short answer is there isn't one question that kind of it really does depend on the type of organization that you're working with. I think there's different. I would say the thing that is the most important within a leader is self-awareness. So really understanding who they are, what their strengths are, what their weaknesses, how they act under pressure, and there's a journey, you're constantly learning on that. But that's the thing that I think of the most. I mean, the one question that comes to mind, which I particularly like, there's a big thing around bias that people just don't, well, people who aren't self-aware as they could be, don't quite realize how it's unconscious, but there's significant bias. So one question that has come up recently that is front of mind at the moment is, can you tell me the last time that you underestimated somebody? Because I just think it encapsulates so much about how people interact with people, about what those unconscious biases are, about which people they didn't think would maybe do as well as they could, because people absolutely judge people every second of every day, because you need to, because we hunt in packs, we're kind of mammals. Actually understanding that. So that's just a question that there's, you can talk around. We quite like the stuff around, can you explain your kind of biggest mistake and what you learned from it? That vulnerability piece and awareness. We've seen people on senior searches, and the differentiating factor when we got down to 2 or 3, well, there's one specifically I can think of where there's 2 candidates who are both absolutely brilliant leaders. And one of them answered that question brilliantly, genuine vulnerability and honesty. And one of them did to start with, and then by the end, actually, it wasn't their mistake. And so I think, it's kind of like, as a leader, if you just go, oh, I really got that one wrong, it just gives everyone's human. Everyone makes mistakes. And that's important. So if you're leading a team, being able to show people that you're like that too is such a massive strength. It shows that you're human. So not quite, as I say, that's the question that comes to mind right now. We would do it against the criteria. So we would every time think about, if you've agreed that criteria, what are the questions? What are the ways that you assess? What's the environment that you set up in the different interviews that we have, or different ways that we assess people? How do you pull out as much as you can? And then the one thing that we would say is the most important is consistency across the number of different times that we speak to people, and we speak to people a lot. And I think probably what we've realized we're quite good at is recognizing inconsistency, even when it's quite subtle. So what they're saying, do they mean it? And is it consistent with what they say at the time? You will adapt to your environment. So it's not to say that people can't get angry at times or be kind of quiet at other times, but is there a thread of consistency with who they are and how they act?
Okay, interesting. So that hints to potentially the value of a multi-stage sort of a process to test people in different environments. But it is, I mean, you without sounding too advertising, you waved the first hurdle book before we got started here.
I just noticed it's actually right here. So look, it's on my bookshelf.
Look at that. Look at that.
I know, and that is, I saw it before I came and sat down. I was like, look at that. It's a good advert there for
But no,
YouTube.
but it's I rib and sort of take the mick out of the questions about, you know, the weakness question, or take, you know, making a mistake, or that vulnerability expose type question, when so it's so easy. And I think naturally I can understand why people might be protecting themselves, because if you say, "Oh, I really messed this up," and there was legal cases, you know, then suddenly you're like, "Oh, whoa, 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 you've over declared there."
Yeah.
But it sort of throws people into the sense of, oh, you know, I think maybe I'm just too charismatic for people. I'm just too good looking for people's liking. You know, that sort of question where they're
Yeah.
trying to basically boast about themselves, or they say, "Oh, I'm just too, so I just love it too much." That type of thing where actually they're trying to present a strength under the weakness question. And I think that is an art of being able to expose a vulnerability of, I've experienced this, my judgments were this, my reflections are this, and I've learned about myself, but I did
Yeah.
make a mistake. It has growth potential to it, but it also is admitting something didn't go right. You
Yeah.
sort of let your guard down. It's quite delicate for people, isn't it, that?
Well, I think, you know, if you look at the senior positions, how you influence people and how you make them feel relaxed and comfortable is a real skill. And you can do that online. You can just, you know, make it, humor is really important, and people recognizing how to use it and kind of being playful with it, and not, you know, serious does not equal professional. The, you know, we see people who, and it's just a protective mechanism sometimes of being serious, because that's what you need to be to show your professional. It's not, you know, you can be relaxed and know that you're capable. You don't have to be serious, because if you are, people don't show their full selves often. So it's just, the better people we see, and it's a generalization, recognize that, and they'll often deliberately make it relaxed at the start and informal, because if you do that, you draw more of people out, because the people can be a bit closed or wear certain masks because they think they need to act in a certain way. So the better leaders are aware of that, and they kind of they set things up at the start to maybe stop that happening.
And I assume that because you're not necessarily just, there you go, we've appointed somebody, off you go, our job's done. You have got that follow up aspect. I assume that what you're looking for is a fair reflection of what someone's going to be like in work, as opposed to a masquerade that you'll put a front on for an interview that
Yeah,
ultimately won't necessarily last once people have got their feet under the desk.
exactly. It's, you know, it's a continuum as a process. It's not a in you go, off you go. And I think because we've moved away from kind of, we will do it sometimes, but that transactional project based recruitment, where we prefer having partnerships with organizations which are in it for the long haul, as in, we're not just here to get a fee to place somebody and move on. We're genuinely interested in people doing well. You know, we don't want to, and what, you know, we're reasonably good at it. You know, it's very rare that people leave roles. You know, we kind of place people, and they tend to stay. And, you know, sometimes, of course, people will move on and go on to bigger and better things. We love it when that happens. But you're right, you go on that journey with them, and you kind of, Anna, my business partner, jokes about this all the time. She's like, you just still want to be part of a team. And I'm like, and I absolutely do. I kind of like, I do miss that. It's kind of like, so every team that we work with, I've suddenly got like 25 results I've got to look for on a weekend. It's like, there's so many teams that we work with now. It's kind of, but I love
And
that. And
then
you
if
do feel
if
a
you've got a
sense of
couple, you've then
responsibility.
got to choose your favourite baby.
Yeah, a little bit. Well, you know, you can always post-rationalize. Well, you know, they'll learn from that defeat. It's fine. For them, that's a good finish. It's. um,
So in the sense, I don't know whether we've sort of almost uncovered it in that discussion, but are there any typical red flags where it's like, oh, okay, now we've had that conversation, or now that we've had that style of discussion, we're probably not going to go any further.
oh yeah, definitely. I think
What are the major ones?
manners, I'd say, is a pretty big one. If you're rude, we're just not. I can think of a couple of people who have particularly spoken to a couple of our more junior people in our business, which is just
Right.
unacceptable. That kind of almost bullying, and I've got a bit of a trigger for bullying, so I just can't stand it. And I just think people who think hierarchically, who think they're better than other people who are below them, that to us is an immediate red flag. It's just, just be a good person. And we definitely see, you can be successful and not be a nice person. And I think, nice is maybe not the best word, but if people speak to myself and Anna in a certain way as the partners of the business, and then speak to some other people in our business who are researchers or consultants differently, and we can hear it or see it, that is an immediate no. It's not an immediate no, but it's a red flag for sure. That kind of inconsistency of behavior, or kind of treating people or talking down to people, or that's awful to me.
And particularly when you see an inconsistency, that you've got a different front for the formal panel interview type situation, and then they'll talk down to the administrator, or it won't necessarily be consistent. Yeah.
Well, it's the classic thing of people in and around interviews being put. So the waiter will actually be kind of part of the interview process if they go for a meal, or the receptionist will be asked what do they think of that person. That is stuff that is set up. So that consistency of who you are and how you treat people is really important. And so that's the obvious one that jumps out, is that just treat everyone the same. Treat people how you'd like to be treated yourself. It's not difficult.
Yeah. You got a full heist going on there by the sounds of it. The dry cleaners you went to 2 weeks ago, they were part of the recruitment process.
Yeah, you could have been nicer to them.
Fascinating, David. Have you got a sense of growing trends that you're having to upgrade your knowledge and understanding of as working demands are shifting and changing, that people are going to have to, you're going to have to recruit for, you're going to have to be aware of? Where's the sort of future out here?
There's been a clear shift since COVID of people candidates being much happier to say, I don't want to work full time in an office 5 days. Even if they thought it in the past, they wouldn't say it until they got the job. Whereas now, expectations of people coming in it's changed, but more importantly, people are more comfortable saying it. And there's a tension there, because it doesn't necessarily work not being in the office in real life in front of people. So that is a tension that's definitely we've seen playing out, because people don't feel connected when they're working from home. Some people are totally fine with it, but generally, if we're looking at, we do most of our work in team sports, there is something missing if you're not then together. And so that's a big shift of just that openness to be together. I'd say that's the biggest one that jumps out. Is there anything else? There's a shift in terms of if the professional sports teams of how they're run. There's definitely a move towards different types of owners that they have, and therefore what that means for organizations and how that trickles down. But I don't think that's really happened yet. The short-term, long-term stuff, that's in flux. It's not a significant change, but the one about what the candidates' expectations are and how that lines up with the people who employ them, there is a shift there for sure.
Interesting. Hey, look, so thankful for you taking the time to, I guess for many people, just have a little look behind the curtain. I think recruitment, that transaction and that contracting that people have going into an organization or being pulled in to deliver a job, I think there's not nearly enough discussed about how it works, how those decisions are made. So I love the way that you're thinking about it. I love the fact that it's not just, bums on seats, get them in. It's much more holistic and constructive about the way you're doing. But thank you so much for the insights.
I would add one thing, actually, Steve. There's a real difference between loving what you do and getting a job. And I think the danger is, if you get this balance wrong, is you focus too much time on how can I get the role. People often say, what do I have to do for you to feel I can get this role. And I'm like, that's not my job. Our job as headhunters in this space is for you to be somebody who could be considered for a shortlist. Once you get on a shortlist, you then have to, of 4 to 6 people who will be interviewed, you then have to interview well. And so I think you don't want to overthink this. You want to love what you do first. And then there are different skills for getting on a long list. So how do you get considered? Then to getting on a short list, to then getting hired. So there are different things, but I think don't overthink it as well. Just love what you do. And if you're good at what you do, you'll develop a good reputation. And that is how people hire on the whole. 10 or 20% might use people like us or companies like ours. But on the whole, somebody in a role will ask their friend who does something else, is there anybody who's impressed you recently? So if you're consistent in what you do, that's the most important thing. And if you're passionate about what you do, that'll come across anyway. You don't have to engineer it. So there are different things, but I think don't overthink it as well. Just love what you do. And if you're good at what you do, you'll develop a good reputation. And that is how people hire on the whole. 10 or 20% might use people like us or companies like ours. But on the whole, somebody in a role will ask their friend who does something else, is there anybody who's impressed you recently? So if you're consistent in what you do, that's the most important thing. And if you're passionate about what you do, that'll come across anyway. You don't have to engineer it or think about it. So of course, we're not downplaying what we do, but I think we don't want to think that, all right, I know the system now, I know how to play it. That's not it, because you get found out if you do it that way anyway. If you love what you do and do that every day, then you'll be happy.
Yeah, when I was researching the first hurdle, I looked at actually there is evidence that you can hack an interview.
Absolutely can.
But
yeah.
that requires sort of almost disproportionate skilling up on manipulating your answers. To which I think
Totally.
actually you need to just develop the skill of articulating your answer, explaining your experience.
But the biggest key there is, like, culturally, if you go for 2 interviews, and we had the situation, so Anna in our business, the example we use is Lego and Amazon. So she did interviews for both. So same role, and she's like, perfect, that's one shortlist. But it's not, because Lego is a family run business. It's all we. Amazon is more I. It's a different set of how you're expected to act. You could totally, to your point, know that going in culturally. You could play that system. You could give the answers that those organizations would want to hear, and you could definitely get both jobs. You could not thrive in both.
You've got to be able to be good at your job, and that when people 6, 9, 10 months down the line, you go, that was a great appointment. Not, have I been sold something differently from how they interview?
That's the worst. You can't. That's where we always say it's much better to not take this job than 6 months down the line regret it.
Yeah. Fascinating. Well, look, thank you so much again. Really interesting. Super expert, but also kind of considerate for the industry of moving it forward. So brilliant. Thanks, David.
Cool. Thanks, Steve. Enjoyed it.
Thank you so much for taking the time to listen. I really hope you enjoyed this week's conversation. Now, we've got plenty more to come, so if you'd like to support and champion us, then take the time to subscribe and leave a review on Spotify, iTunes, Stitcher, YouTube, or wherever you tune in. You can also give us a follow on Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. All the links are in the show notes. So in the meantime, have a great week.